Veoma mi je drago što ste me pozvali na ovu konferenciju. Hvala Nadi i Gilu. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting conference at the most terrible time that your country is facing. It has been a real shock flying yesterday morning over Obrenovac and seeing the absolute devastation, and the only sort of word that came into my mind observing this horror was anxiety. That's why I will start my presentation with a little bit about sort of how we are dealing with anxiety in circumstances like this and in general with troubles which we are facing in society and as individuals. And then I will move to another concept which I want to sort of develop a little bit more broadly, which is sort of ignorance, which is often an answer when we are very much facing anxieties that are life-threatening. And then I will move to kind of exploring with you a certain kind of a trend, how in today's time we are trying to find answers for what is anxiety provoking with the help of new technologies, sort of trying to see inside of the body and in some way trying to predict and forecast what might come in the future, of course, paradoxically creating more anxiety than ever. Now, when I'm sort of observing devastation that is happening in Serbia, of course, the first thing that comes into my mind is that when we are facing such catastrophes, quite often we are trying to find some kind of an answer. And often conspiracy theory emerges as a particular kind of answer, which is why I was in some way not surprised when yesterday, speaking with some locals here, I observed that immediately conspiracy theory emerged that floods are sort of kind of happening because of some activity of American satellites. And when I was sort of in the evening after I heard this theory about some activities which presumably provoked heavy rains, then when I was sort of researching how could this happen, what might be maybe the basis of this thing, I realized that there has been quite a lot of actually conspiracy around the world related to the fact that American satellites are actually not warning, countries where floods might actually happen. And probably some of you still remember that just a few years ago we had a trial in Italy where scientists were sort of accused that they did not warn enough the people there because of the sort of some signs they had that an earthquake might happen. Now their response was that they did not warn because they were afraid really that whether they know enough to sort of cause tremendous anxiety of people in the future. So quite often nowadays we have an imagination that we might sort of prevent risk, that we might warn people what might happen in the near future. And actually with this idea of how we are trying to figure out what might be risk-provoking, quite often we increase particular kind of anxieties. Even in the domain of the social, we are obsessed with preventing, forecasting what might happen in the future. Probably, still most of you remember how before 2008 economic crisis, there was a huge belief that in the domain of finance, there exists like a kind of a perfect way of prediction and forecasting. Americans, for example, truly believed in the power of a program called VAR, Value at Risk. Now, this program, which sort of masterminds the future investments, was supposed to be 99% accurate. Now, whenever someone tells you that something is 99% accurate, you have to always think about this 1%. Now, we often sort of kind of neglect the 1%, and the 1% in the program were related to the fact that they didn't envision that the whole market can actually collapse. And even more technically, they did not, when creating this program, they did not actually look at the data from the previous crashes because they were too far into the past, which is why they only took the last 20 sort of years of prosperity as data out of which they were trying to predict and forecast what might come in the future. Now, when we are under the grips of anxiety, it is very hard to sort of create an image of what is anxiety provoking, especially an image of, sort of what might be that image of the object that creates horror. Now, quite often, art is a way to deal with this horror. And just a few years ago, French artist Christian Boltanski created an exhibition in Grand Palais, which probably most of you read about, where he collected 50 tones of clothes. And the whole exhibition was sort of kind of written about a kind of an exhibition which is dealing with absurdity of today's time, our overconsumption, with kind of a dread that all these, images kind of create, and, also with the feeling of death, dying. There was some kind of almost a feeling of ghosts, being in this place of abandoned clothes, and we can imagine also, a lot of the clothes belong to people who are not anymore with us. Now, I was shocked when I saw yesterday in our Slovenian news. Sorry, this is Christian Boltanski, and this is actually not Boltanski, but this is the image which I saw in yesterday's issue of Delo, Slovenian newspaper from Belgrade. So when I saw this image, and before sort of images of Boltanski, it was very hard to kind of, let's say, imagine the difference. Although both images in some way deal with horror, death, catastrophe, leftovers from dead people, helping, people who are currently experiencing the worst catastrophe in contemporary Serbia. So we can see that in some way Boltanski's show somehow touched something that actually, happens in reality, but, in some way, what we're seeing with this image is a completely new context and, in a way, a completely new way of dealing with what is anxiety provoking. Now, when we looked in the past at the issues, how societies dealt with anxiety, we saw that quite often societies at the moment of crisis try to envision, where does this object, the anxiety-provoking object, actually comes from. Now, if we look at Hollywood B movies, quite often we can see interesting shifts and answers throughout, quite recent history of how we were imagining this object of anxiety. After World War II, especially in the United States, we saw a lot of films which dealt with sort of social anxiety at that time by envisioning danger coming from the outside. Like the films were even entitled, They Come from Outer Space. Now, all these films at that time were kind of mostly playing out the danger of communists coming and sort of infiltrate themselves in the American society, brainwash American society, which is why films like They Come from the Outer Space, although they deal with extraterrestrials, the extraterrestrials are actually an image of the communist threat. Now, over the years, the shift over where is anxiety coming from, more and more started shifting into the inside. The inside of the social, the society as such, not simply from the outer space or another country, and also the inside of the human body. The biggest shift happened sort of in the sort of 80s, where we have films like Alien or even The Fly, where the subject himself changes into a horrible alien because of a mistake in his experiment. And the film They Come from Outer Space actually was remade into They Come from the Inside. Most of you also probably still remember the famous X-Files series, where at the end of the series they're obsessed with genetic change that they are observing with some people for whom they perceive they are extraterrestrials, but at the end, Agent Scully realizes that she herself already has genetic change in her own body. So in a way, alien becomes placed inside society. Also, when we become obsessed with terrorists, who are often depicted in the same way as forming cells, as we are sort of thinking about, in a way, a human body, white cells fighting with the aliens inside, like viruses, bacteria, and so on. Now, as I said, we often have a problem attaching an image to something that we perceive as horror. Today, more and more people have a problem also with sort of perceiving themselves and actually finding an image of themselves, which is why psychoanalysts are observing a lot of sort of symptoms which are related to the inability to recognize oneself in the image. There is quite an increase of people, for example, who are ruining mirrors. They cannot observe themselves in any mirror that they have in their flats or even in public spaces. And there are quite often a lot of sort of people also who are trying to find an answer to sort of what is anxiety provoking by trying actually to actively look inside their own bodies. Now, new technologies like fMRI, PET scans, any other ways we are looking inside of the body are presumably giving an answer to this anxiety. But as I said before, paradoxically, quite often they are increasing our anxiety. Now, not sort of a few years ago, National Geographic has been obsessed with trying to figure out who is behind this famous image. As you know, the National Geographic has been using this image for 30 years and has been pretty much using this image on all their advertising poster of the famous Afghan girls. Now, when they decided to finally find the Afghan girl, many women came forward claiming that they are the famous Afghan girl. And their stories quite often didn't match the story of Steve McCurry, the photographer. However, then one woman, Shabbat Gulag, story actually matched the story of the photographer. But National Geographic did not believe her story. Although using the image which I just showed before, it was all about stories. It was all about creating fantasies, identifications. The woman, Afghan girl, was like a quintessential, woman, child, someone we feel threatened by, someone who provokes us with her gaze, someone who creates an urge sometimes to help. But when they found Shabbat Gulag, what National Geographic decided was they needed a scientific proof that this is the same woman. So they sent an image of her iris with the image, with the image from the previous photography to a New Jersey laboratory which analyzes irises. And it was only when they got scientific proof that the iris is the same in both cases that they officially announced that the woman has been found. Now, the horror, of course, is that they still continued using the image of the young girl because how Shabbat Gulag looks now was just not probably attractive enough, or that she aged too much, and basically she was quickly forgotten. Now, this example shows us that we have a particular obsession now to find in science an answer to sort of what is in us more than ourselves, even in answer in cases where the whole case was based on fantasies, on stories that we were telling around a particular image. Now, this turn to look inside the body is particularly observed with how we deal with neuroscience, and the second case is how we are now dealing with genetics. Now, before going a little bit into this field, let me point out that we have a particular paradox in today's society. On the one hand, we're obsessed to see inside, to predict, forecast, to find material basis even for banality like this, whether an image and a woman go together. But on the other hand, we had a tremendous capacity for denial. And that's why my point is, in some way, that ignorance is on the rise. in today's society. So the obsession with predicting, forecasting, seeing inside the body paradoxically goes together with a particular enjoyment actually not to see, close our eyes, and deny. Now, in psychoanalysis, all these terms have been very much analyzed. And Sigmund Freud's point was that there is actually quite a power in the sort of strategies of negation. One of the most famous examples from Freud's work is when he encountered a patient who said, the woman in my dream is not my mother. Now, for Freud, this was quite an interesting thing because no one said to the patient that the woman in his dream has anything to do with his mother. So why did the patient have the need to negate something, to deny something that wasn't even in the conversation? So Freud's idea was that with the negation, we are in a paradoxical way naming something and telling at the same time that this what we are naming is not true. So for Freud, in some way, negation always has to do with a particular way the subject is dealing with some element of the repressed. Let's say here in repressed idea linked to his mother, in a way that we are consciously then denying this element that is in a way emerging from the domain of the unconscious. So in a way, negation becomes some kind of a strategy to make cognizant what is repressed, what in negation, denial, also they label in a way what is repressed. In some way, we are recognizing temporarily that, but not accepting what we are denying. Now, of course, denial also always allows a careful listener to, in a way, guess that there is something important behind that denial. Through denial, therefore, we are, in a way, inadvertently, kind of, or indirectly, revealing some kind of truth. But the important thing is that denial is not a lie. It is rather kind of a testimony that there was like an incomplete moment happening, a moment where, the repression didn't work totally, and a kind of a context of the repressed becomes temporarily recovered. So we can say that a conscious lie would be a form of deceit, but denial would rather be kind of a form of impotence, a certain sort of a surprise for everyone involved. Now, Freud also paradoxically links these moments of negations and denial to freedom. His idea is that negation is actually a moment where something opens up for the subject, where a new creation might be possible in the future. So negation also opens a certain kind of a distance and kind of, let's say, a possibility of something new to happen. Now, in today's societies, we have many, many ways of how we are using negation, denial, ignorance in the domain of politics. And what I want to just briefly mention, since we are in the midst of this catastrophe, very important ways we can observe this negation, denial is how we are dealing with climate change. Now, since I have a teenage son and I have been bombarded with episodes of Simpsons, I saw in one episode of Simpsons a really interesting sort of take on this problem. In one of the stories, the little girl Lisa was asked, Lisa is the brainy child in the Simpson family, was asked to make a school presentation of how their town, Springfield, will look in 50 years. Now, Lisa thoroughly starts researching climate change. Her presentation becomes the most gloomy possible presentation. She shows total devastation, like the end of Springfield in 50 years. Now, teachers become terribly concerned. So they call parents, and they said, this is awful. Your daughter has a particular disorder. She's becoming so gloomy after this presentation. You need to take her to a psychiatrist. Now, of course, they do. Now, the psychiatrist decides that Lisa has an environmentally related despair. a new symptom. And they decide to give her drugs. The drug is called ignorital. So Lisa starts taking ignorital. Her outlook really completely changes. You know, she sees everything in flowers. You know, she has kind of images of teddy bears smiling from above, and you know, everything is perfect. Now, at that time, parents become even more concerned because they are afraid that Lisa is becoming totally delusional. So at the end, you know, they decide rather, you know, to have gloomy Lisa than a delusional happy one and take her off ignorital. Now, we can say that we have been under the dosage of ignorital for quite a long time. You know, the whole populations have been sort of living in some kind of a space of denial about possible catastrophes that might happen because of climate change. And the ideological battles that have been going on between the scientists and, you know, the skeptics of climate change have been incredibly successful, actually, for the skeptics. Now, it is incredibly difficult for us in some way to think about the future, to imagine, you know, the world in 50 years or even in 200 years is incredibly problematic. That's why we are obsessing thinking about the past, but actually very little about, you know, what might happen in the future. Now, scientists who are dealing with sort of climate skepticism are pointing out that quite often this skepticism, on top of being very much part of ideological, political battles, has to do with our anxiety over death, dying, decay, which we would need to sort of deal with if we were to take seriously, you know, discussions about climate change. So there is a kind of an anxiety over change that is often behind the kind of a skepticism or denial that we might see among, you know, the kind of populations, especially among populations in very wealthy countries. A very interesting example here is Norway. You maybe don't know that this very wealthy country is one of the biggest polluters. Because they are pumping oil like crazy, selling it around, and, you know, of course, we know that the whole technology they are using, but also, you know, what oil is doing is, you know, affecting our climate. Now, researchers who looked at denial among people in this rich country saw two ways this denial operates. On the sort of, let's say, plan of the social, especially the political, there is a very interesting interpretation, you know, why it is necessary for this country to in some way close their eyes in regard to climate change. So quite often their politicians are reasoning in the following way. Yes, we are truly polluting the world. Yes, we are sort of relying on oil, but we are in some way sacrificing ourselves for the good of others. What's the idea? Behind the idea is if we stop pumping oil like this and selling oil all around, then poorer countries will go back to coal. Now, since we know that coal is even more polluting than, you know, oil, it's better that we sacrifice ourselves, pollute a bit, but then, you know, prevent greater damages around the world. Now, normal people have another strategy often. In their self-perception, they perceive themselves as lovers of nature. There is no more nation of love for nature. You know, people all the time are sporting, go to nature and so on. They even recycle and so on. But at the same time, they have perception. This self-perception is enough for them. They actually have no need to engage socially to sort of convince the government to do something more in regard to climate change. Now, why? Quite often behind is a fear for change. They know very well that their prosperity relies on oil. They are afraid of a change that might happen and might affect their well-being, which is why they can easily close their eyes in front of sort of the questions about climate change. Now, behind most of our anxiety, therefore, is the fear of death, dying, decay, if it's about climate change or if it is something about our own body. Now, I mentioned before that we have more and more this turn into the insight, and at the end, let me just briefly sketch a little bit what I have been working on, trying to tackle the anxiety, the new forms of anxiety, insight. In criminology, there has been a terrible turn into trying to see inside of the brain the secret of the human being. Especially in the United States, there are more and more trials where scientists are trying to sort of look inside the brain and determine whether someone is capable of standing trial, and also civil trials where people who maybe commit financial frauds are claiming that they have done this because a particular part of their brain has been affected and they maybe couldn't calculate properly money. Now, they always calculate money in such a way that they grab more money for themselves. So all the damages I looked, you know, there has never been a case that someone would say that he made a mistake and sort of didn't take enough money for himself. Now, we even have a whole kind of new imagery of how to figure out where particular, you know, sort of, let's say, behaviors are placed. And, you know, we have a kind of a whole obsession that with the new technology, we might actually, you know, come closer to the truth of the subject. And of course, we should not forget that a lot of this research is sponsored by the American military, which is interested in finding the ways of controlling the minds of the soldiers, controlling the minds of the enemies, making the soldiers forget the trauma, being more endurable, and so on. Now, when I was sort of looking at, you know, how we identify with these images, I realized that quite often we are creating particular kind of stories, and we are relying on other types of stories. Now, when scientists are interpreting us, what is inside of our brain, one brain here is supposed to be of a pathological psychotic killer, another one of the normal human being, you will see that usually two scientists will not have the same explanations, and they will very much rely on particular kind of fantasies they are creating around these computer-generated images. If you study a little bit more neuroscience, you will also see that usually two machines will not create the same images, and that it's quite arbitrary how we decide which colors will be representing what. And basically, that there has been, you know, a huge kind of a dispute whether we can really, in a way, locate our behavior anywhere, you know, related to the brain. Now, another move that sort of happened, you know, is another kind of problem that is happening also, that is that most of the research in the domain of law has been done on people who are already in prison. And we can imagine that being in prison does change our, you know, ourselves, and that probably, if we are for a long time in prison, something, you know, will change also in the way our brain reacts. Now, another important turn has also been into the genetics. We have more and more studies which are trying to look at the question if there are born killers. Studies about the MOA enzyme, the idea being that people who are violent maybe have a deficiency on this enzyme, which is why they react more impulsively, have been ongoing. Although they have been highly criticized, there have been sort of also numerous kind of sketches trying to figure out, of course, whether with the help of genetics we can help people who are already on death row, and there have been huge successes in the United States with innocence projects. But more and more we are also sort of endangered that we might actually become victims of people who are interpreting our DNA in a way quite arbitrary. That's why in some of my work I have looked at sort of psychological make of the researchers who, unfortunately, I have seen, especially forensic scientists, sometimes are making up stories that DNA matches, you know, material that was found on the scene of the crime, just to convict pretty much innocent people and to make kind of law operative again, or to make an authority, like a prosecutor, retain his power. Now, the next danger is, of course, that we have more and more genetic testings in the workplace. And, you know, neuroscience is becoming one of the tools also which employers are using when they are assessing if someone is fit for a particular job or not. Now, the surprising thing is that this turn to inside the body, let's say especially if I stay at the end just a little bit with genetics, is that it actually does not appease anxiety. For me, the most interesting stories are about people who are trying to predict, forecasts, which kind of illnesses might affect them in the near future. We know that we can have tests for BRCA1, BRCA2, the breast cancer gene. There are tests about, other types of cancer. Now, the surprising thing is that a lot of people who are very anxious and are searching answer in the truth, in the real, in the body, when they get negative result, their anxiety doesn't appease. They are searching for another test, another object that might be, let's say, the object that causes them anxiety. And of course, this object is very much linked to their perception of dying, decay, and of course, the impotence we have in preventing dying and decay. Now, especially people who are, trying to figure out whether they might develop cancer, they ask this question in an interesting way. They often do not ask whether they will develop cancer, but when. When will I develop cancer? As if they are taking this notion of risk as a kind of a fate they cannot escape, something that, that anxiety, that, is so anxiety-provoking, but something that is actually a fate. Now, people who are guessing also whether they will, their children will have a particular genetic deficiency are dealing with other types of anxieties. Anxieties of what they are transmitting to the children, what they have maybe taken, on themselves, So the whole family usually starts being kind of played out through this family fantasy, through this search to find the truth in the subject. Now, I remember when my son was about 8 years old or so, and they were studying genetics for the first time in school, he came home very anxious and angry and said, Mom, when you decided to reproduce, why didn't you sort your genes? And I said, which genes should I have sorted? And she said, the gene for myopia. I'm wearing glasses because of the genetic thing I inherited from you. And you should have first fixed that gene and then decided to have children. You're guilty, the usual idea. Okay, I was shocked. And then he said, but happily, 50% of my genes came from my father, and there I got some very, very good genes. So I said, which are particularly good genes that you got there? And he said, I got from my father a gene for not having too many friends. Now, that was, of course, criticism, because at that time he had 1.5 friends. Rastko's son was one of them, and there was half of another friend. But in some way, we can say he was playing out, fantasies, angers, transference, especially to the usual problematic person who in the family is the mother. Now, let me conclude by pointing out that all these searches for, trying to prevent death, decay, anxiety, of course, have been with us for a long time. Now, we should not forget the famous saying by Kierkegaard that, if death is anxiety-provoking, then immortality is even more anxiety-provoking. Now, when we are trying to sort of figure out the future, we should sort of also not forget a very interesting saying by Paul Valéry, who said that the problem of our times is that the future is not anymore what it was. Now, when we are thinking about this, we can say in some way that we always feel that, that we kind of don't have anymore a proper idea of the future. Now, of course, we can say we live in times when quite often we think that the type of democratic organization that exists in the developed world or the type of capitalism that we live is here to stay. That's why, unfortunately, when we are thinking about sort of the future, we are more and more actually playing out the present. Now, I loved from the 50s, reading about the TV shows in America and examples that at that time, a famous comedian, Steve Allen, decided to create a show which will be radically different. Instead of the usual quiz type of shows where people are supposed to give answers to questions, he decided to create a show where there will be answers, but people had to invent questions. So the show was called The Question Man. I think that more than ever, we need today precisely a kind of a return to the question man. Instead of, behaving that we have answers, we need to actually accept the fact that we need more and more new questions. And as for the future, we maybe need to remember the saying by Einstein, who said, "I'm never worried about the future, since it always comes too early." Thank you.